we're going to get maritime to zero emission, it's got to be hydrogen. It's physically impossible to do it with batteries.
Greetings, Earthlings, and welcome back to Earthlings 2.0, the show where we explore how we can be better versions of ourselves and create a world we actually all want to live in. Today, we're diving deeper into how the maritime industry could decarbonize with hydrogen. We touched on this a bit in our past episode on fuel cells, and today we're going right to the source, as our guest is the U.S. Department of Energy tasked with studying various aspects of hydrogen power for marine applications to either prove or disprove its viability as a power source. And the findings were so positive that he ended up proving it could be done with the world's first hydrogen-powered commercial vessel. But before we beam up our guest to our proverbial spaceship, I'm your host, Lisa Ann Pinkerton. I'm the CEO of the award-winning PR firm Technica Communications and founder of Women in Clean Tech and Sustainability. Before building those organizations, I was an award-winning environmental science reporter for NPR and PBS. And in a world where technology continues to overtake our lives, Earthlings 2.0 is a virtual third space for us. People such as yourself who want to learn and gain inspiration from those of us who are leading the global Earthling experience to make changes on this planet that we all need to survive and thrive. And each guest is tackling the fight against a big challenge that we face in the 21st century, and each in their own unique way. Like take the production team, for instance. They're also fighting these challenges by bringing you these stories every week. And there's a lot of people on this production team, let me tell you. So your monthly investment into this education could be joining us on Patreon for $5 a month. You'll get access to exclusive content and other hidden surprises. I am working on a t-shirt. It's happening, I promise. And I am willing to bet that the ROI you will receive through the show well outweighs $5 a month. But you'll have to subscribe to find out just how much. And if this show has taught you something or inspired you in some way, we ask that you leave your thoughts in the form of a rating or a review on your preferred podcast app. Thank you for those of you who have been leaving us reviews. It is really helping. And always, thank you to Resource Labs for having us on the network. Now, according to the U.S. Department of Energy, approximately 3% of annual greenhouse gas emissions around the world come from the maritime industry. And most of that is shipping goods and commodities around the world, as you can imagine. If that 3% sounds too small, it is not. It is equivalent to 54.6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide annually. It's a lot. And because of this growing demand for shipping, the sector's carbon footprint is poised to potentially surge to 10% of global carbon emissions by 2050. That is, if proactive measures are not taken. And mariners have a few options. They can decarbonize with liquefied natural gas, also known as LNG, biofuels like methanol and ammonia. And then there's battery electric or hybrid systems for shorter routes. Europe is adopting a lot of electric systems right now. And today's guest would say hydrogen fuel cells are the best option for most maritime vessels. As a quick primer, fuel cells work by splitting hydrogen molecules into protons and electrons. And when they take different paths to reach the cathode, they travel through an external circuit and it creates electricity, and the output is water as a waste product. Now, that is a very simplified version of what happens. I am not an expert, and I'm sure those of you who think or know if I got it wrong, you're welcome to let me know. Go to social media. Hit us up. Let us know what you think. Our guest today, however, is an expert. His name is Joseph Pratt, and he is the CEO and CTO of Zero Emission Industries. And before shoving off on this entrepreneurial journey, Joseph was the founder and manager of Sandia's Zero Emission Maritime Program. Sandia is a U.S. national laboratory, and Interestingly enough, it wasn't the prospect of green hydrogen that made him set sail on this adventure almost 20 years ago.
It's even almost like a coincidence to me. Great that it's green, but that's almost like a byproduct. Being able to make it anywhere from sunlight, yes, of course, means it's green, but it also gives us a huge amount of flexibility that we've not really had as long as we're, looking at centralized, fuel production and oil distribution and all that. To me, the green part is just another benefit of being able to get this source of energy anywhere you can.
And you started exploring specifically the potential of hydrogen in maritime applications way back in what we're calling the 2010s, after sort of the first hydrogen bubble had burst, right? Arnold Schwarzenegger had promised us this hydrogen highway in California that never really happened, but you kept going with it. And I was curious to know, why did you focus on this when everybody else was sort of moving to battery solutions?
I guess I started looking at hydrogen and maritime because I was really one of the few people at the National Lab System who knew about both worlds. And so kind of combining those in the question that came from the DOE to me was, does it make any sense? Can we even think about using hydrogen to power large ships or boats or anything in the maritime environment? So I did a study, and that study showed that two things. Number one, batteries have a limitation on where they can be used in the maritime sector. They're pretty good for smaller vessels who are on predictable routes that are going kind of back and forth where you can recharge often. And then I found that hydrogen fuel cells could power, any of those vessels and also the bigger vessels. So the vessels that are anything from tugboats going in the harbor to feeder ships out, kind of going out into the ocean, and then all the way to sort of the transoceanic container ships and tankers. I was actually pretty surprised to find that there was no limit on what you could power with hydrogen fuel cells. So I guess to answer your question, why focus on hydrogen? Because hydrogen is the only possible solution for the vast majority of the maritime fleet. And so if we're going to decarbonize, if we're going to get maritime to zero emission, it's got to be hydrogen. It's physically impossible to do it with batteries.
Because basically it's just the huge vessels that need to move through the water and have the ability to go where they need to go to avoid weather and other obstacles to get where they're going, right?
Yeah, that's part of it, but even on smaller vessels. So what it really comes down to is batteries and hydrogen, when you compare their ability to store energy, you can store, the numbers vary on the exact technology, but somewhere around 20 times more energy in the same form factor with hydrogen than you can in today's best lithium ion batteries. And so at small scale, like a car, for example, those two kind of even out. They're pretty close. But when you start scaling that up, hydrogen scales its energy storage much better than batteries. So even going to a small ferry, you can't power that ferry with batteries on a normal route. And then as you get bigger and bigger, that disparity gets even larger. So it doesn't take long for hydrogen to win out and become the better system or the only possible system to make it work.
And so you mentioned some of the research that you conducted early on, and you've written a lot of papers on hydrogen for the maritime industry. I'm not going to belabor the point with naming them all.
Thank you.
Let's just say you know your stuff. And I'm curious to know from your perspective, though, what were some of the biggest takeaways that you received from doing that research? Anything that surprised you beyond what you already shared?
Yeah, there were a few things that surprised me. Number one, when I first started looking at hydrogen for maritime, the state of the art, the common sort of application for hydrogen was light duty cars. And those engines are maybe 100 horsepower, maybe a little more, and they only store, roughly 5 kilograms of hydrogen. And when we started looking at maritime, people were asking, could we do a few megawatts and could we store tons of hydrogen? And it was just a completely several orders of magnitude different than what anything had been done in the past, that I was frankly surprised when we were able to find something that worked. I think what a surprise for me was how enthusiastic the industry was on this idea of hydrogen for maritime. So these studies, they were not just me sitting at a desk, at the national lab. This was me collaborating with over 200 people out in the industry to make it actually a real study, something based in reality. And through all those interactions, got to know a lot of marine vessel owners and operators, workers, shipbuilders, naval architects. And I was overwhelmed by how positive the response was from these people who would say, wait, you're telling me that I can put a hydrogen fuel cell on this vessel and I never have to use diesel again? I don't have to have combustion engines. I'm not going to get any pollution. It's going to be quiet. And I can meet all the air quality regulations that are getting more and more stringent every 5 years. Where do I sign up? I didn't expect that kind of response. And that frankly was when we kind of put all these pieces together of, here's a technology that we've shown technically it can work. And then here's a market that seems to really want it, but there's nothing out there that they can buy right now. There's no fuel cell that goes on a boat. And that's when the idea to start this company came up and said, okay, here's a demand and something I enjoy working on, and let's see if we can make it happen.
Yeah, wonderful. And so this company, Zero Emission Industries, tell us a bit about what you've been working on and your technology.
Yeah, so we started in 2018, and the first thing that we did was got a grant from California Air Resources Board to build the world's first hydrogen fuel cell powered ferry. And that project, we can get into it more, but that project is what really kicked off our company. Our whole goal at that time was to bring hydrogen power systems to the maritime market and do it in a way that would work for that demand. As we've gone through that experience, we've learned a ton about how the technology needs to be designed and developed and rolled out into marine. It's quite different than any other market out there for many reasons. And we've also found that the technology that we're developing for marine is a one-for-one applicable to other industries like on land trucking or locomotives or things like that. The marine environment is really demanding, and if we can solve the problems there and provide solutions there, then they work in pretty much any other industry as well. So that's kind of that trajectory that we've taken.
Definitely want to get into the vessel that you built in a moment, but I'm curious, I can guess, why the maritime environment is so demanding. Something about salt water, I'm sure, plays a big role. But so how are you thinking differently about the way you're designing these fuel cells so that they can operate in a marine environment?
Yeah, there's really 3 parts to that. There is the actual environment, as you mentioned, the salty water and just constant humidity. Those requires different kinds of materials to make it not essentially eat itself away in a year. So that's a big part of it. Number 2 is sort of the what I call maybe the duty cycle of how these engines are used. And this has nothing to do with fuel cells. It's just when you get on a workboat, those engines are put to work right away. You don't get in your car and push the accelerator to the floor and hold it there for 8 hours. You get going and then you back off and you're maybe only running at about 10 or 15% power, even going 70 miles an hour down the freeway. But in a boat, because you're pushing water out of the way constantly, those engines have to run at such a high load all the time that it puts quite a different type of demand on the engine and all the components surrounding that engine. And then the third part is regulatory. In the US, the United States Coast Guard has jurisdiction over most types of commercial vessels, passenger ferries and tankers and all that. And those regulations, and I used to work, with fuel cells focused on aircraft, but the U.S. Coast Guard regulations are some of the most stringent I've ever seen in terms of safety. And the reason is because when you're out in the middle of the ocean and something goes wrong with your boat, you have no other choice but to get on a really small other boat and hope someone finds you. So safety is paramount. That's what we mean by, overall marinization and how we can take an off-the-shelf fuel cell that might be made for a car and then wrap it with our ZeroEI system and able to get it to work in a way that marine operators expect.
I like that. It's like you're putting some foul weather gear around a conventional fuel cell.
Yeah, I wish it was that easy, but yeah, that's a good analogy. I like that. Yeah, that's cool. We'll wrap it in a raincoat, and yeah, that'd be great.
There you go.
But a ZeroEI branded raincoat, then we're good.
There you go. So your first project was the world's first commercial hydrogen fuel cell vessel called the Sea Change, and it was is a ferry in the San Francisco Bay Area. I wasn't able to figure out if it's still operating or not, so you can tell me that as well. But would you please tell us the story of this project, what you guys did to build this vessel, and then what were the results of that work?
Oh, that's how much time do you have? No, I'll try to give you a summary. As you mentioned before, I've written a lot of studies. And the marine industry is rightly so very conservative when it comes to adopting new technology because of the need for high durability and reliability and safety. And so even though on paper we had showed everything could work, we found out pretty quickly that it didn't matter to the marine industry. They weren't going to adopt a new technology based on a piece of paper. They needed to see it, touch it, feel it, ride on it, drive it, in order to say, okay, I see how this works. I trust it. So that's when the idea for what's now called the Sea Change came about, which is let's build a ferry and let's not just build another kind of hydrogen demonstrator boat, that works on a lake or whatever, but we wanted to look and feel like a regular ferry in real service. So that was our goal from the beginning. Of course, we didn't do the boat design or any of the boat components. We're really focused on the powertrain and especially the hydrogen side of the powertrain. That's where we come in. The technical side, the regulatory side, I had been working with the Coast Guard since 2013 when I was still at Sandia on helping them understand hydrogen so it could be safely implemented on boats in the United States. So continuing that relationship, working with them on actually now implementing it, that was a lot of time and resources because everybody wanted this boat to be reliable and safe, to do that in the right way. And then it was actually first launched in late 21 and first fueled in late 21. And then it was still at the shipyard through most of 22. Getting final fit and the final Coast Guard approvals. We did fuelings there. And then it was brought down to the San Francisco Bay Area last year. And we've been fixing, going through shakedown tests and commissioning trials and getting the local Coast Guard sector approval before operating. So it's very close now to being able to run on the San Francisco waterfront. I don't have a perfect timeline on that, but we expect it sometime in the next few months to be running for the public.
So it sounds like you first fueled it and tested it up there in Washington.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, in Bellingham, Washington. Yeah. So that's where it was launched, out of the shipyard, right out of the shipyard there, and did the first fuelings up there. The fuelings were a big step. because, right now, if you want to fuel something with hydrogen, you'd normally need a hydrogen fueling station, like build one, and that takes a few years and a few $1 million. And we knew that we couldn't do that at every dock where that this boat might visit. First of all, we didn't have the money from CARB to be able to do that kind of thing, but also we just knew it would be an impractical solution when most boat operators are used to fueling their vessels by having a diesel truck show up and just fuel it and then drive away. So we knew we had to have that capability for the sea change. We invented that system that can do that. It's all self-contained on the boat. A truck of compressed hydrogen rolls up on the dock. A hose comes off the boat. It connects. A deckhand or captain with a touch screen in the wheelhouse can transfer hydrogen safely without being a hydrogen expert. And then the truck goes away and the boat can sail. So doing the first fuelings up in Washington were a big deal to exercise that system and show everybody how it works and how simple it really can be.
And being up there in Bellingham and the San Juan Islands, I mean, you're going to encounter every type of weather system and current system up there. So it's a great place to do some sea trials on a new vessel.
Yeah, I don't know if our primary engineer at the time enjoyed doing that in the middle of December. I think he would have much preferred that it was in the summertime. But yeah, I love it up there. It's beautiful.
And that fueling system that you've developed, it seems like that could be applicable to other hydrogen-powered applications, not just the marine environment, right? Trucks, I assume, and other types of vessels, or vehicles, I should say, could also leverage that technology, especially since we're still waiting for the hydrogen fueling infrastructure to be built out, right? It's a chicken and the egg problem.
Yeah, that's spot on, Lisa Ann. That's something that we never actually thought about when we invented that system to fuel the sea change. But as we were able to use that and other people got to see how that worked, they said, hey, could you use that same system to fuel a locomotive? What about a Class 8 truck? What about an airplane? And technically we said, yeah, sure, why not? And then we started thinking, wait a minute, there seems to be a real demand here for something like this because, as you pointed out, the fueling stations, number one, they're not being built as rapidly as people want. And number two, the stations that we have are just not as reliable as people want. That was kind of the second half of my job when I was still at Sandia, working on hydrogen fueling station technology to increase their uptime and safety and reduce their costs. And that's really, really challenging. So having a solution that kind of bypassed the whole need for infrastructure is very attractive, especially in these early days of hydrogen, where people are trying to get their trucks and locos and everything else out there, but there is nowhere for them to fuel. That's definitely the roadblock. So yeah, we have now turned that system from the sea change into a product that we're rolling out in the next few months here, primarily to the trucking industry. There are a lot of Class 6, Class 8 heavy-duty trucks that have been designed and are being built with fuel cells. Just look at Toyota, Hyundai, Nikola, Hyzon. They're all rolling these trucks out, but the fueling stations aren't there that they were planning on. So it's a really big opportunity for us. We're excited to have kind of foreseen the issue, many years ago and developed a solution, and now it's coming to fruition. So yeah, it's pretty cool. I don't like it that there's this bottleneck in the hydrogen industry, as a whole, but it's pretty cool that we have a solution that can solve that.
I think it's, necessity is the mother of invention, right? And I think that's right. I think you've really landed on something here that's going to help advance the hydrogen industry simply because, like you said, this fueling structure isn't available where or when people need it. We have a bunch of hubs that are being designed for green hydrogen. I can see an entire service industry of trucks going out to bring fuel to other places from those hubs to then expand the the coverage area, if you will, of those green hydrogen hubs, which could be pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah. The hydrogen hub thing, the DOE funding for that is a really big deal. I'm excited that they're doing that. It's creating a lot of momentum around hydrogen, but it's gonna take years. So we're kind of that interim solution, and everywhere hydrogen starts anew, we will have the solution to help kickstart that.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of timelines, I can see how different types of vessels in the maritime space would benefit from hydrogen in different ways, and there might be some sort of layered adoption going on as this technology rolls out. What applications do you think are going to be the quickest to adopt hydrogen as a power source?
Yeah, that's something we've thought about a lot. Of course, being our business, right? We have to understand our timelines. I'll kind of start in reverse. So I think the hardest things that are going to be adopting hydrogen are the transoceanic ships. These are the ones that's kind of gets the most focus, when people talk about, oh, we need to clean up shipping. But to do that, it's not so much the onboard technology. People are making moves toward that. Like KHI built the Suiso Frontier. It holds a huge amount of liquid hydrogen on board. It's a carrier. So there's storage technology that's been developed. There's fuel cell technology, which is easily scalable to multi-megawatts to power these ships. The studies that I wrote at Sandia, just without any optimization, showed that these power systems can handle the demand of these vessels and get them, from Shanghai to Seattle, all that kind of stuff. The problem is the fuel infrastructure around the globe to be able to support these vessels does not exist today. And if you look at, essentially they had the same problem in the early 2000s with LNG. People wanted to use LNG, but you couldn't get LNG anywhere around the world. And that is, it's still being developed 20 years later, the LNG infrastructure. So, to me, that's kind of the longest one, and it's primarily due to infrastructure and fueling availability around the globe. So that's kind of the hardest one. The easiest ones are going to be sort of the smaller vessels that are running around in harbors and things like that, because you can develop, like in conjunction with the hydrogen hubs, for example. If there's a hydrogen hub in LA Long Beach, you can develop a lot of vessels that can be users of that hydrogen production and distribution capability there. And because they're all coming back to the same point, every day or every week or something like that, they can refuel whatever the usage of the vessel is. So then I kind of break that segment into two parts. One is what we call inspected vessels, and these are vessels that the Coast Guard has extremely strict regulations on, like the Sea Change. It's a passenger vessel, very strict safety regulations. And then there are so-called uninspected vessels where the regulations are a lot lighter. And these are vessels that are typically smaller. They're not carrying the public. So there's less of a risk there. Because of the current state, or I should say lack of regulations around hydrogen for maritime, it's getting into the weeds a little bit, but it takes a long time to work through that regulatory approval process to get to the point where the Coast Guard is comfortable with hydrogen-powered vessels for inspected vessels. It could take years to do that. So in terms of fastest, it would be the uninspected vessels that are kind of being locally used there, where we can build it to our standards, which we believe are extremely safe and reliable, but do it in a faster way than going through the Coast Guard process and having the hydrogen readily available. So, building up from these sort of local, smaller vessels up to a little bit bigger local vessels, and then maybe, there's hydrogen vessels in the Bay Area, hydrogen vessels in LA. Now maybe you can start running, feeder ships between the two. So you start building out the hydrogen capabilities regionally. And then you can start connecting the dots and eventually getting to the transoceanic, right? So that's kind of how we see it rolling out anyway.
So you mean uninspected vessels like private fishing boats or things like that?
Yeah, there's a lot of uninspected vessels that are commercial use. So fishing boats is a great example. Even just a regular like ski boat, right? Recreational boats. Those are all uninspected vessels. Big demand there as regulations and local policies are trying to get rid of gasoline engines off of sensitive lakes and things like that. What are you going to do? But then there are things like small tugboats or crew boats that are taking, the crew from a container ship maybe at Anchorage, taking them into shore. It could be like wind farm service vessels, survey vessels, government boats. So there's a huge range of vessels that are uninspected but still doing pretty heavy duty work.
I can see your point about these big container ships because you're right. They do get a lot of the attention because they're using some of the dirtiest fuel, bunker fuel, like you mentioned before, right? And in certain locations, especially on the West Coast, I know that they have to switch to a different type of fuel once they get into local waters because those localities don't want that dirtier fuel and the emissions related to that in their local atmosphere. So when it comes to those big vessels, do you think, like right now, they're already switching from bunker fuel to a cleaner fuel? And sometimes I think I read one application is to then switch to batteries just to get into shore. But I don't know how feasible that is the larger the boat is. So do you think there might be some interim application where they switch to hydrogen fuel to come into port and then leave and then switch to bunker fuel again?
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways to kind of solve that issue. We have definitely talked with companies who are interested in kind of, generating hydrogen while they're steaming across the open water and then switching over to hydrogen power as they get close to shore. That's, I guess there's so many, potential ways to do it that it really comes down to what's most cost effective, right? Especially if we talk about the shipping industry, it's commoditized, it's really low margin, so they're extremely cost sensitive. So how do we meet the regulations in the most cost effective way, right? I haven't done a ton of work on seeing what those options would be and which one pencils out, but I'm fairly sure that the large companies have, the shipping companies who are doing this, because we've had conversations about doing this kind of exact thing or just having full hydrogen vessels. Things like hydrogen combustion has come up. So people are struggling right now with trying to figure out what is that solution. I feel for the big shippers because these assets are things that take 5 to 10 years from, decision to build and get on the water. And then they've got, at least 30-year lifetime in them. So they've got to make decisions today that are going to be correct 40 years from now and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And they're seeing all these winds of change with regulations, and everybody's got a new fuel idea that they say is the best one. And honestly, I don't know how they figure it out. Like there's so many different possibilities and so many different options here. Our whole goal is to make it easy for them to use hydrogen if that's what ends up making sense for them.
Well, I think that's what's cool about imagining the future, and in this case, hydrogen. We don't know the answers yet. We're going to figure them out together.
Yeah.
And what is Captain Ron is like one of my family's favorite movies, and our favorite line from that movie is like, "Well, if anything's going to happen, it's going to happen out there." And it's really true. Like until you start applying this technology, putting it out on sea trials, using it, it's hard to anticipate how beneficial one solution might be compared to another. This is how reality works, and this is how you discover what's going to work. You just have to get out there and start using it. So I enjoy hearing that your experience with the maritime industry is that people are receptive and eager to adopt these solutions. It's just a matter of how quickly they can do it, because this industry is still rather young in its development, even though we've kind of been talking about hydrogen for almost a decade or more at this point in terms of trying to get it moving. It's still growing as an industry. And so economies of scale haven't been reached. The supply chain hasn't really been built out. All of this stuff is going to come in the next, 5 to 10 years, I would say. We're a futurology podcast. So we're attempting to understand what's happening today and how can we use that information to predict or make better decisions for the future. So if you're thinking about the maritime industry and its adoption of hydrogen, what advice would you give it collectively as it's looking at the next 5-10 years of development? Like you said, they're making these decisions today, vessels that are going to be running for at least 30 years, if not more.
What advice would I give? I think, number one, don't compromise on what you need. So I don't want people to lower their standards in maritime, which are super high, to accommodate new technology. I think technology should be able to develop to meet the standards of the maritime industry. I think that's what we have to do. And we have to do it in a way that's cost effective and reliable. So I think that should continue to be the demand on the hydrogen industry collectively, both on the hydrogen supply and on the power systems on board. I think there are things that vessel owners can do to try to make it easier to adopt hydrogen if they're not quite ready today. But there are certain things they can do in vessel design. For example, installing, having an electric drive system. And maybe it's a diesel electric hybrid today, but you have those electric motors already spinning the shaft. It makes it a lot easier to swap those out with fuel cells later, for example. Maybe there's some, design decisions they could make to add an extra bulkhead somewhere or something like that to be able to accommodate putting hydrogen fuel tanks in there instead of diesel tanks. So if someone, really wants to commit to doing hydrogen at some point with that vessel, but they're not ready to do it today, then I think there are design decisions that can be made to make that a lot easier in 5 or 10 years. I guess, maybe another bit of advice that we haven't really talked about is it's probably going to take longer than people think. And we don't like to be the company who makes a lot of promises and then doesn't deliver or delays or anything like that. I think, unfortunately, there's been a lot of hype cycles around hydrogen, and there's been a lot of expectations set that haven't been met. And I think that's done a disservice to some part of the industry and also set unrealistic expectations. So I think if people really want to do hydrogen for maritime, that's fantastic, and we will work with them every step of the way, but we want to be realistic up front. This is going to take time. It's going to take effort in these early days. Our whole goal as a company is to create technology solutions that make that simpler. We take the hard out of doing hydrogen. We do all that in-house. So what they get is something that looks and feels, very much like a Caterpillar engine. With the same kind of service network and integratability and everything that they are already used to. If we can do that, then we've done everything that we can to make it easy to adopt. And that's really what our focus is, easy adoption.
Earthlings. The Sea Change vessel in San Francisco's Bay Area is going to be a game changer for both decarbonizing marine transport and for hydrogen in general. So we'll put some more details of the project in our show notes. Suffice it to say, it's a 45-passenger vessel. It's a catamaran, and it will start service pretty soon. So keep your sensors pointed at Zero Emission Industries to watch their advancements in this space. I know we will. Our faith in humanity is restored this week by Brett Hughes, a marine ecologist at Sonoma State University, and Christine Angelini, a coastal ecologist at the University of Florida. And of course, the rest of their science team behind some research that was published in the journal Nature recently that showed the return of sea otters to the Monterey, California coastline also helped restore the declining coastal marsh habitat. This is a groundbreaking study, and this team of scientists wrote that the sea otters slowed erosion of the area's marsh banks by up to 90%. So the coastline got in trouble when sea otter populations declined to near extinction levels because of fur trading and the harbor that was built in the 1940s. This led to a destabilization of the estuary habitat to such an extent that there was a dramatic surge in the number of shore crabs populating the marsh. In the 1980s, conservationists near Big Sur brought back California sea otters throughout the state. And in the estuary in Monterey, thanks to these furry crab-eating friends, what would have cost tens of millions of dollars for humans to rebuild is now being stabilized for free, or actually in exchange for a crab feast. It's a demonstration that Angelini said shows that the conservation of top predators can really enhance the health and resilience of a system that otherwise is under a large portfolio of stress. It just goes to prove that when we are in balance with nature, we can turn back some of the destruction that some unwitting Earthlings might have caused, given the right opportunity or crab dinner incentive on this beautiful blue-green space flower that we call home.